By the 17th century, London was no longer a modest medieval town. It had become one of the largest cities in Europe, with a population approaching 500,000 people. This was a dense, constantly moving city, its rhythm shaped by trade, by the flow of people, and above all, by the relentless current of the River Thames. The city was growing faster than it could control itself. Narrow streets, tightly packed housing, and crowded river wharves created an urban space that was both vibrant and fragile. London kept expanding, yet it was still bound to the structure of an older era, one in which everyday life unfolded in cramped conditions, poor sanitation, and constant risk. Today, with the help of AI technology, I'm James, and I'll be taking you back into those spaces, not just to look at them, but to observe 17th century London as a living city, with depth, movement, and atmosphere that historical paintings and engravings could never fully capture. In the 17th century, Old London Bridge was far more than a structure spanning the River Thames. It was a complete living space, a neighborhood suspended above the water, linking the heart of London to Southwark on the southern bank. From a distance, the bridge nearly disappeared into its dense mass of buildings, resembling a continuous row of houses rather than a bridge in the conventional sense. Lining its entire length were tall, multi-story homes, shops, warehouses, chapels, and fortified gatehouses. These structures were packed so tightly that the roadway below was cast in near constant shadow, with upper floors jutting outward over the passage beneath. People lived directly above the ceaseless movement of carts, pedestrians, and goods. Life on the bridge unfolded in cramped, noisy, and dangerous conditions, yet it persisted, generation after generation. From an engineering standpoint, the bridge rested on a series of massive stone piers, with narrow arches beneath them. This design choked the tidal flow of the Thames, creating powerful currents and dangerous surges of water. Navigating boats through the arches was notoriously difficult, and accidents were far from rare. During harsh winters, the restricted flow even contributed to the river freezing over, transforming the area beneath the bridge into an extraordinary and unfamiliar landscape. Below Old London Bridge, the Thames functioned as the city's primary transportation artery. Boats carrying timber, coal, grain, textiles, and imported goods from across Europe moved constantly along its surface. The river connected London to the English interior, to continental Europe and beyond, to the wider Atlantic world. At this crossing point, local daily life collided directly with global trade. But such density came at a cost. Fire was a constant threat in a built environment dominated by timber. Congestion was unavoidable, and sanitary conditions steadily deteriorated. Yet for centuries, Old London Bridge remained irreplaceable. It was the only permanent crossing of the Thames in central London, forcing all north-south movement through this narrow bottleneck. By the mid-18th century, time and relentless use had pushed the bridge into serious decline. Between 1756 and 1762, the buildings that had crowded its surface for centuries were gradually dismantled. Old London Bridge ceased to function as a residential space suspended over the river. Even so, its legacy continued to shape how London understood infrastructure, commerce, and urban space for generations to come. While much of 17th century London was being pulled into dense, high-pressure spaces like Old London Bridge, a very different kind of environment was quietly taking shape on the city's western edge. These areas lay beyond the medieval urban core, where population density was lower, the air was cleaner, and the pace of life noticeably slower. It was within this setting that Buckingham House emerged. By the late 17th century, Buckingham House was still just a private residence, carrying none of the symbolic weight of national power it would later acquire. It was built on the western fringe of London, at the transition zone between an expanding city and countryside that still retained its calm. Unlike royal palaces tied closely to ceremony, politics, and constant human traffic, Buckingham House stood apart, silent amid open land, gardens, and wide, undeveloped spaces. This location was no accident. It reflected a growing trend in 17th century London society, the desire to escape the suffocating conditions of the medieval city. As London became ever more crowded, coal smoke, noise, and poor sanitation turned into unavoidable features of daily life. In response, the upper classes began seeking more private environments, places where they could exert control over their surroundings. Buckingham House, therefore, was not a center of power, but a strategic spatial choice. It represented a shift in how people organized their lives. From tightly packed, multi-purpose spaces within the old city to a clearer separation between work, public life, and private residence. Its very existence shows that London was no longer growing only upward and denser, but also outward, gradually pushing its urban boundaries farther away from the River Thames. Viewed from today, 17th century Buckingham House stands as a quiet yet significant marker. It signaled a transformation in London's spatial structure, a city moving away from a closed medieval form toward a more open urban landscape, where power, daily life, and space were no longer concentrated in a single core. A city compressed for too long will eventually expose its own weaknesses. By the mid-17th century, London had become a densely packed metropolis. Houses pressed tightly together, narrow streets winding through the city, and most structures built from timber. Decades of rapid growth had far outpaced the city's ability to manage planning, fire prevention, and sanitation. In such conditions, even a small incident was enough to shake the entire city. In September 1666, a fire broke out in a modest residential area and quickly spread beyond control. Strong winds, dry weather, and the city's cramped urban fabric turned the flames into an unstoppable force. Streets designed for another era became corridors of fire, funneling the blaze deep into the heart of London. Key districts were consumed one by one. Ludgate went up in flames, and Old St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the greatest symbols of medieval London, collapsed under the sheer intensity of the heat. Seen from the River Thames, the city appeared as a continuous wall of fire, where the boundaries between homes, commercial centers, and religious spaces completely disappeared. Within just a few days, most of medieval London had been reduced to ashes. Neighborhoods that had stood for centuries vanished, leaving behind a landscape of devastation unlike anything the city had ever known. Yet within that destruction, the Great Fire was more than a catastrophe. It forced London to confront the limits of its old urban model, where density, building materials, and the absence of planning had become constant dangers. When the flames finally died out, the city stood at a historic turning point. Reconstruction was not simply about rebuilding what had been lost. It became an opportunity to rethink space, materials, and urban order. London began to transform, gradually moving away from its fragile medieval structure toward a city that was more organized, more resilient, and better suited to a new era. After the Great Fire, London was forced not only to rebuild its urban fabric, but also to reassert its sense of order and authority. In a city deeply scarred by catastrophe, the Tower of London still stood firm along the banks of the River Thames, an immovable anchor of royal power in a time of profound uncertainty. By the 17th century, the Tower of London was no longer just a fortress. It had become a multifunctional complex, serving at once as a military stronghold, an armory, a treasury, and one of the most notorious prisons in England. Its thick stone walls and fortified towers were designed not only for defense, but to project a visible, ever-present image of power into the daily life of the city. Within those walls, prisoners accused of treason, from nobles to high-ranking political figures, were held while awaiting trial or execution. The tower was therefore not merely a place of confinement, but a political instrument, where royal authority was enforced directly and without compromise. At the same time, it safeguarded royal records, weaponry, and the crown jewels of England, reinforcing its role as both a physical repository and a symbolic core of the state. The tower's location further amplified its significance. Positioned directly along the Thames, amid the constant movement of people and goods, it was not isolated from the city, but embedded within it, fully visible to merchants, sailors, and ordinary Londoners. Power here was not hidden. It was displayed as an inseparable part of the urban landscape. In a London rapidly reshaping itself after the Great Disaster, the Tower of London represented continuity between past and present. As entire neighborhoods vanished and were rebuilt from the ground up, this structure stood as a reminder that no matter how the city's physical form might change, the core structures of royal authority endured. The Tower of London remained not merely a monument, but a quiet declaration of order, control, and power at the heart of the city. If the Tower of London was where power was contained and protected, then Cheapside was where power was put on display. In the 17th century, Cheapside was not merely one of London's busiest commercial streets, it was the city's most important ceremonial route. This was a space where the everyday lives of merchants and residents intersected directly with royal ritual and the political symbolism of the kingdom. Lining both sides of Cheapside were shops, homes, fountains, crosses, and temporary structures erected whenever major events took place. On ceremonial occasions, the street was transformed into a vast stage where royal entourages, soldiers, officials, and massive crowds gathered to witness authority performed in public. One of the most notable moments came in 1638, when Marie de' Medici entered London to visit her daughter, Queen Henrietta Maria, and King Charles I. At the heart of Cheapside stood the Cheapside Cross, a familiar landmark and a focal point for public gathering. Beneath banners, decorations, and formal rituals, the street pulsed with movement and sound. Yet behind this spectacle, deeper tensions were quietly building. The presence of a Catholic queen, along with continental European influences, unsettled many Londoners whose identities were strongly shaped by Protestant beliefs. Cheapside therefore functioned as more than a ceremonial avenue. It reflected the growing fractures within English society. Processions meant to reinforce royal authority often exposed the widening gap between the court and the people. In public spaces like this, where power was performed before the crowd, religious and political conflicts became increasingly visible, signaling major upheavals on the horizon. Today, Cheapside still exists within modern London, even though most of its medieval structures have vanished. But in the 17th century, it was a place where ceremony, commerce, and social tension coexisted, a space where the appearance of order concealed profound instability beneath the surface of the city. If Cheapside was where power was performed before the crowd, then Westminster was where power was decided. Located to the west of London, along the banks of the River Thames, Westminster in the 17th century was the point where politics, law, and religion converged. This was not a space of everyday life, but a place where decisions shaping the fate of the entire kingdom were made. At the heart of this complex stood the old Palace of Westminster, the seat of Parliament and the core of England's political authority. By the mid-17th century, it had become a focal point of rising tension between the monarchy and Parliament, especially as the English Civil War tore the nation apart. The palace walls did more than witness debate. They reflected a profound shift in how power itself was understood and exercised. Adjacent to the palace was Westminster Hall, one of the largest and most enduring medieval structures still standing. With its vast interior and immense timber roof, the hall hosted major trials, state ceremonies, and public events. In the 17th century, Westminster Hall embodied both the weight of traditional royal authority and increasingly the stage upon which that authority was challenged. Nearby stood Westminster Abbey, the spiritual heart of England. For centuries, it had been the site of coronations, royal funerals, and the burial of kings and queens. The abbey reinforced the sacred bond between monarchy and religion, presenting political power as part of a divinely sanctioned order. Yet by 1647, the abbey itself stood in a state of uncertainty, as religious divisions shook the spiritual foundations of the nation. At the foot of the Westminster complex lay Westminster Stairs, a busy landing point on the Thames. In an era when overland travel was limited, the river served as the primary artery of movement. Politicians, clergy, envoys, and royal officials arrived here by boat, moving directly from the water into the center of power. The Thames, therefore, was not only a commercial lifeline, but a direct route to authority. Westminster in the 17th century was not crowded or chaotic like the heart of London. Instead, it projected an image of order, restraint, and control. Yet beneath that calm surface lay profound instability. It was here that decisions on war, religion, and law were made, at the very moment when England's traditional structures of power were being challenged from within. Along the north bank of the River Thames, Whitehall Palace in the 17th century stood as the largest royal residence in England and the administrative heart of the Stuart court. It was not a single building, but a sprawling complex stretching along the river, made up of halls, living quarters, and offices, where the business of the state was carried out as part of the court's daily routine. Whitehall was inseparable from the Thames. From its riverfront steps, kings and courtiers regularly traveled by boat, underscoring the river's role as a direct route to power. The palace's position along the water made authority visible. Anyone arriving in London by river could see the center of royal government rising before them. By the late 17th century, much of Whitehall was destroyed by fire. Today, only the banqueting house survives, the final remnant of what was once the core of royal life. The disappearance of Whitehall reveals the fragility of power when it is bound to physical space. and how history can erase even those centers once thought permanent. But not every expression of power chose to remain within the city itself. A short distance southwest of London, Richmond Palace represented a very different choice. Rebuilt during the Tudor period and still in use in the early 17th century, Richmond was a retreat where monarchs escaped the suffocating pressures of London. Cleaner air, open landscapes, and a slower rhythm of life made it a favored royal refuge. It was here in 1603 that Elizabeth I spent her final days, bringing the Tudor dynasty to an end. Over time, the palace fell into decline and was dismantled. Today, only faint traces of its walls and layout remain, hidden beneath riverside paths and modern streets. Placed side by side, Whitehall and Richmond revealed two faces of power in 17th century London. One was a center of administration, ceremony, and constant political pressure. The other was a space of withdrawal, where authority stepped away from the city in search of calm. Together, they reflect a city learning to separate governance from habitation, between the performance of power and the deeply human need for quiet. Looking back at 17th century London, what emerges is not a static city, but a living body in constant motion. From the narrow streets of the medieval core, through infrastructural choke points like Old London Bridge, to the centers of authority at Westminster and Whitehall, London was shaped by the continuous collision of people, commerce, and power. The city grew faster than it could govern itself. Pressure accumulated in its urban structure, in its building materials, and in the rhythms of everyday life, until it finally erupted in the Great Fire of 1666. Yet that destruction did not mark an end. Instead, it forced London to rethink itself, its spaces, its order, and how a city might endure in a more sustainable way. Alongside ceremonial and administrative centers of power, London also revealed another impulse: the search for distance. From Buckingham House to Richmond, authority did not exist only at the most crowded core, but also sought separation from the city in order to survive. London, therefore, expanded not just inward and upward, but outward, forming layered spaces with different functions and different tempos of life. What makes 17th century London remarkable is not any single building or isolated event, but the way all of these elements coexisted. This was a city still marked by its medieval past, yet standing on the threshold of the modern world. Decisions made within the halls of Westminster, ceremonies staged along Cheapside, and personal choices about where to live or where to withdraw all helped shape the London that followed in the centuries ahead. Today, many of these structures are gone, and many spaces survive only in maps and memory. Yet the framework left behind by 17th century London still endures. The city's roads, river routes, and centers of power continue to follow patterns first established during this period. This video uses advanced artificial intelligence technologies to reconstruct historical environments based on maps, paintings, and verified archival sources. While every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, these visuals are artistic interpretations and hypothetical reconstructions, and should not be considered exact photographic representations of the period.